to the second in a series of 7 live webinars in honor of the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And thank you all to those of you who are attending with us again today. I'm Frances Littman, the founder of the Creatively United for the Planet nonprofit society, and your host for this week. I'd first like to acknowledge we are hosting this webinar on the traditional territories of the Coast Salish people here on beautiful Vancouver Island, for whom we give thanks for this privilege and their stewardship from time eternal. We have much to learn. On behalf of Creatively United and our Earthfest partners, John O'Riordan of the Gail O'Riordan Climate and the Arts Legacy Series and the Wildwood Ecoforest Institute Society, we welcome you all from near and far on this international webinar. It's my heartfelt pleasure to introduce Geraldine Manson and Dr. Nancy Turner. Geraldine Manson is a member of the Nanaimo Nation and respected elder in residence at Vancouver Island University. Geraldine serves her community in numerous ways, including as an elected council member, elders coordinator, and carries many other responsibilities that relate to culture and traditions in the community. Geraldine gives credit for her cultural wisdom and education to her elders present and elders past. She will share her firsthand insights and perspectives on transformation and sustainability. Dr. Nancy Turner is a renowned ethnobotanist, author, and retired professor in environmental studies at the University of Victoria. Nancy has worked with First Nations elders and cultural specialists in northwestern North America for over 40 years, collaborating with Indigenous communities to help document, retain, and promote their traditional knowledge of plants and habitats, including Indigenous foods, materials, and medicines, as well as language and vocabulary relating to plants and environments. Nancy will describe some of the lessons she has learned from Indigenous knowledge keepers throughout British Columbia. But first, Geraldine will share with us a traditional opening prayer song to mark the beginning of this gathering. Oh, 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 CM Solelo, ancestors of the land, we look towards you, raising our hands to this beautiful morning, thanking you for the journey throughout the night, thanking you for taking the tiredness away and replacing with this beautiful energy that you have given to each and every one of us that are here today. I thank all those who have joined us this morning to hear what we have to contribute to this talk on Mother Earth and all its beautiful resources. I ask Great Creator and Solelos of the land once again to guide us ever so gently, reminding us through a whisper if we have forgotten anything. Haichika. Oh, 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 oh. Haichika.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today, especially with my dear friend Geraldine. It's an honor to be participating with you, Geraldine, and thank you for that beautiful song to start us off in such a good way. I too would like to acknowledge that we here on the traditional territory of the Nanaimo First Nations and the Tsuminas First Nation is the area around where Wildwood is, where our Ecoforestry Institute has the stewardship of this beautiful forest that you'll hear more about, and hopefully you'll be able to visit one day. And we appreciate how the ancestors and the current peoples of this area have cared for this place and all the species that are there for the lands and waters for many generations. I want to acknowledge that what we're sharing with you today has been shared with us generously from so many other knowledge holders, elders. Dr. Ellen White, who is a mentor for Geraldine especially. My friends, Dr. Richard Atleo, Kim Rakamakludisi, Clan Chief Adam Dick, Quaxis Dalawakla, Dr. Luce Chim Arvid Charlie from the Cowichan Nation, and William White from Cowichan and Snuneymuxw, Elsie Claxton, Violet Williams, Chris Paul from the Saanich Nation, and Satlama Joan Morris from the Songhees Nation, many, many others. Haich Kusiam. These people who have learned from their own elders over time, who've been out on the lands and waters of their territories, are what I call cultural refugia. They're the equivalent of those precious areas that during great disturbance, like a flood or a glacier, retained the species in that area. And these people have retained knowledge over times of great change and have been able to bring that knowledge forward and to share it and teach it again with all of us. And we're all the beneficiaries of it. And again, these are some of the elders who have been my teachers over, I have to say, over more than 50 years of working and learning from these people. Many of these people have passed away, but to me, they're still with us today, as I'm sure Geraldine will appreciate as well, that these people never leave us. We can hear their voices even today. So we have Evelyn Windsor from the Heiltsuk Nation in the lower left, Hilda Austin from Lytton, the Nkikatmuk Nation, Margaret Sywellis from the Newhawk Nation, Clan Chief Adam Dick, I mentioned, Quaxistalawasha from the Tawadena First Nation of the Kwakwakwa, Chief Ernie Hill from the Gitkat Nation, the head Eagle Chief, passed away a couple years ago. There's Satlama Joan Morris again, and Elsie Claxton from the Saanich Nation. And in the top right-hand corner, Ida Jones from the Dididat Nation. These are just some of the people who have provided the knowledge and the insights that we're sharing with you today. I especially acknowledge Dr. Atleo, Umik, who is one of the founders for the First Nations Studies program that Geraldine Manson is now a major part of at Vancouver Island University. He was the co-chair of the Clayoquot Scientific Panel, the author of 2 amazing books about Indigenous knowledge systems. And I've always, he's been a good friend and a teacher for me for many years. So it brings us to the current series, the webinar series that Frances has been organizing with her colleagues. And I want to thank Jake for his technical expertise here, and all of the people who've been involved in creating this amazing series in celebration of Earth Week. Yesterday, we were privileged to hear from Bob Sandford of United Nations University. His talk was so informative, and he spoke about some of the negative things that have been happening in the world, the pointing out that we've created a very bad situation in the world by not heeding scientific evidence of climate change and trying to ignore it. And it's led us to a lot of global problems from deforestation, pollution, mass extinctions, and catastrophic loss of biodiversity, the global climate change, and now we have the COVID-19 crisis. But all of these things, especially the crisis that we're in right now, has allowed us to sort of, as he said, hit the button, to stop and think about other ways of living and ways that we can live on the planet more sustainably, and rethink our relationships with the earth and other species. And that's exactly what he asked. How can we transform our world? And today, Geraldine and I will talk about Indigenous knowledge and wisdom and ways that Indigenous knowledge can contribute to the overall question of how can we transform our world. It's, as I said, such a delight to be co-presenting with my friend Geraldine, who is elder in residence at Vancouver Island University. She's very knowledgeable about her own cultural traditions and practices, history and language. And she's working on a book, which will be out soon, on Snuneymuxw traditional place names. She's working with elders. She's documented over 70 different place names in Snuneymuxw territory, including village sites, camping sites, fishing sites, and spiritual sites. And it will not only be a book itself, but it will have a touch screen and audio component to it, so that you can go to a touch screen, you can touch on a place, you'll hear someone pronouncing the place name properly, and maybe learn some stories about those places. So Geraldine, would you like to talk a little bit more about this project, which is very, very important?
Yes, thank you. The Snuneymuxw traditional place names didn't happen overnight. It happened many years ago in the 90s, when we sat with the old people who knew all the place names, who knew where they were, whether it was a village, camp, or other site. And I had this in my notes, but then comes along the linguistic to put the place names into the phonetics, how you see them on the map. And the old people, each one with the booklet, will share the importance of each site that you see. This is just partial of the map that we have. Like in Departure Bay area, it was our winter village site, Stanilup. It was a village where 3 of our villagers came from Nanaimo River area to move there and stayed there for the winter. So the booklet, it's been a long time coming, and now through the university applied for the grant that allowed me to do the touchscreen map and the booklet.
That's a very exciting project. Thank you, Geraldine. That's going to make a huge difference for people to know the names of these places, because those reflect the history of your people living on the land and in the waters. And that reflects also what is often called Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge and wisdom. My friend, Dr. Fikret Burkus, who's now retired, but from the University of Manitoba, has written a book called Sacred Ecology, which is now into its 4th edition. But he has given a definition of Indigenous knowledge or traditional ecological knowledge that I like to use. It's a cumulative body of knowledge, practice, and belief, evolving by adaptive processes and handed down through generations by cultural transmission. And Fikret visited us up at Hartley Bay and the territory of the Gitcat Nation, so the picture is from there. And the picture also on the screen is of my friend Helen Clifton from the Gitcat Nation. And here is an example for me of cultural transmission. This is learning by doing. She's teaching her little granddaughter, Janelle, who is now a grown young woman. But Janelle is working with her grandma. They're pounding halibut walks, dried halibut, with a U-wood maul and a big pounding block. And Janelle has her own little maul and block. And she's just having fun with her grandma. But she'll remember that her whole life. She'll remember doing that. And now she knows how to do it. And she'll be passing it along to her own grandchildren one day. So this, sometimes people don't like the word traditional when we say traditional knowledge, but to me, it doesn't mean that it's only in the past. It's a living knowledge system that is based on tradition. It's based on generations and generations of knowledge that's been accumulated and passed on. Focused often in one area, one locale, the Snuneymuxw area, for example, and embedded in a whole system of values. So people have been living here on our coast for 13,000 years, or probably more now, since the ice melted from this area around that time. And even before, when there was still ice here, people were already living along the coast here.
And also to add on to that, ancient knowledge with all the places that we have, not only within my own community, but other communities. And one of the major supportive recognition of what the old people say is through our archaeological sites. And these archaeological areas that we go and do, whether it's a reburial or whether it's a new home being built there, we go and find out the history of it because it's adjacent to one of our sites. And through my old people, they talked about the longhouses in Departure Bay where our winter villages was. And with here, because there was 3 tribes moved there, there were few chiefs along the side. But one of the village longhouse had some of these tools in there that the old people talked about orally even before we did that project. And evidence comes from the ground when we do these projects, how old the site is and how old the artifact is and substance use. And over generations and generations, it's the same. So yeah.
Thanks, Geraldine. That reminds me that there's archaeological sites where they've shown that some of the techniques for weaving basketry, they go back thousands of years. People learned and they've adapted those processes, but they're steeped in tradition going back that far. Just to show you the region that we're talking about, I know we have people listening from around the world, and we're so happy to welcome you to our region of the world, which is the Northwest Coast and Northwestern North America. But just so you appreciate the diversity that we have, what we would call biocultural diversity. If you look at the map, these maps are drawn by my friend Dr. Nancy Mackin, but they show on the one hand the rough traditional territories of about 50 different First Nations language groups from central Alaska down to the Columbia River. And the Rockies, 50 different languages or major dialects. And then on the other map, showing you some of the major vegetation zones that we have, from the montane forest, the coastal Douglas fir forest and coastal western hemlock, the northern boreal forests, and within those, all the multiple habitats, the wetlands, the rocky areas, the sandy areas, the prairies, all of that. If you put those 2 diversities together, you get tremendous biocultural diversity in this region. some of the traits that we associate with this Indigenous knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge. We've already said it goes back a long, long time, but it doesn't mean that it's just stuck in the past. People adapt over time because they've lived through, you can imagine, 10,000, 14, 15,000 years, all of the changes that people have faced, climate changes, floods, volcanoes, volcanic eruptions, fire, sea level change, all of these things, changes in distributions of plants. So they have to adapt, and they're still adapting today. But the knowledge builds up over time. It's cumulative. There are different ways of teaching. There's the way of participating, but there's also formal teaching during the ceremonies and the potlatches that people have, where the histories are recounted and children are taught to listen and to pay attention to their histories and the different connections. The knowledge is both overarching and very specialized, and people are always experimenting. The knowledge is also embodied in the language, in the stories, in the narratives, in the words and vocabulary, the place names. And it's very much based on specific territories and different ecosystems. Geraldine, do you want to add anything to that?
I think what I would like to add to this, through your slide here, the different plants and the locations of them. Here, Nancy has a photo of the CMT, the bark that was stripped from a tree. Here in our own community and other communities are the same. And the plants that we use, like the Devil's Club and the salmonberry, you know, so vital in our community, and how we use it and how we prepare it for medicine or for just a tea, the Devil's Club. But, and using the berries and the roots of the berries to make color. You know, all this was passed down generation to generation. So yes, it's a whole new way of understanding our surroundings, whether it's up in the mountain or the river or the ocean, back on land. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. The culturally modified cedar there in the picture is from the Gitcat territory, from the Gitcat seaweed camp at Kiel. And that's a huge cedar. It would take people with their arms extended to go around that tree, maybe 10 people. And they've had pieces of bark taken from that tree several times over centuries. And so this shows that one single tree, which is still living today, can provide for people in a sustainable way. And the halibut, they're hanging in the sun, even knowing how to cut the halibut properly, how not to make thick spots or spots that are too thin. If it's too thick, it won't dry properly, and then your winter food supply is going to spoil. So even things like that, it's part of that knowledge system. The knowledge of variety, like the different colors of the salmonberries, which is embodied in the song of the Swainson's thrush when it sings in the Saanich-Sanchafan language to the salmonberries. It talks to the different color forms of the berries and tells them to ripen when it's singing its song. All of those things are part of this amazing complex system of knowledge. So here we have all the resources. For example, the forest resources. We think of the people living here along the coast as saltwater people, and indeed they are, but they all need the resources of the forest to survive along the coast. You need your baskets from forest materials to store your seafood and to cook your food. You need the cedars to make your canoes to get out on the water. You need the cedars for your houses and your poles, and all of the other materials that you need. You need your fuel, All of that comes from the forest, from the plants of the forest, the berries and the greens that you get from forests supplement and complement the rich and nutritious foods that you get from the ocean.
And then to add to this, the use of the forest, there's protocols that go with the forest. Whether you're going up there to get the resources or the logs for planks for the houses, to making canoes, etc., to picking berries and getting the medicinal plants and materials, there's protocol. Not just anyone can go, I'm going to get up tomorrow and go and get this and take it home. No, we have to, there's preparation you do prior to even the day before of even going, putting your thought to whatever you're going for and what you're looking for. If you don't follow the protocol and you're looking for a certain medicinal plant, you're not going to find it. But if you do the protocol of through prayer and through rituals, that path will be made for you to go and get what you need. And how you make the things like the nets and they're using the branches for weaving. Again, protocol comes to mind, how to connect to these branches or the barks and roots. Yeah, it's a special thing we do. We have to prepare ourselves, our mind and our whole body, inner spirit, before we go out into the forest. And then when we go to the forest, we do the prayer song or a song that acknowledges our presence. So the cedar trees and all the other trees surrounding and the animals know we're coming and they're welcoming us into the forest and clearing the path to where we need to go. Yeah.
Thank you, Geraldine. I've heard that many, many times from many different elders. You have to connect, you have to acknowledge the other species that you're depending on, to thank them and to give them respect. So here's another way of looking at Indigenous knowledge systems. They embody not just the practical knowledge, which everyone needs to survive for sure. What things are edible? What can you eat? What can't you eat? What's poisonous? How do you harvest it? Where do these things grow and live? When do you harvest them? How do you prepare them? Those are all important parts of the knowledge. But you also need to know the effective ways of teaching that knowledge, passing it along, sharing it with the younger generations, with other members of your community and beyond. And as Geraldine has already explained, there's an underlying philosophy or worldview or way of connecting, way of thinking about the other species that we're involved with, that we're related to. And that's part of the whole knowledge system. Then you have to have ways of ensuring that the resources are looked after properly, and there's decision making and planning that goes into that, ways of governance. And all of this knowledge is embedded, as we said, in this long time frame of cycles of knowledge going back that vary over time, over generations, with the seasons, with the years and the cycles that go on, the tides and so forth. I see this picture is my friend, Dr. Mary Thomas. She's harvesting bark from a cherry tree up in the Shwetmuk or Shuswap area around Enderby and Salmon Arm. And she's being very, very careful because she knows that you can harvest the bark of the cherry tree if you're very careful by peeling it off the outer bark and leaving the inner bark intact. And that won't girdle the tree, and the tree will continue to live. And that's how she's practicing there. She's carefully peeling that bark away, but she's respecting the life of that tree. She knows that she can harvest that material without harming the tree, without killing the tree. And that's what she's doing. And she would have prepared herself to do this work, just like Geraldine described. And there we have another culturally modified tree, or CMTs, they call them in archaeological work. But there are many different kinds. It's the cedars that have had bark taken from them are one kind of culturally modified tree, and the cherry tree or the birch tree that's had bark taken is another kind. There are many, many other kinds of these trees, and they all represent sustainable use of other species, of the plants and trees and shrubs that people rely on for their materials, for their food and so forth. When you're harvesting medicine from bark, you would just take a small piece from the tree. You would not girdle the tree. If you're harvesting inner bark for food, which people ate in the old days from pine or hemlock, again, you wouldn't girdle the tree or cottonwood. You would just take a strip from the tree.
Mm-hmm.
The basket there is made by William White from Prince Rupert, who learned his basketry skills from his auntie there. And he's a well-known basketry artist in the north, on the north coast there. Even the harvesting of pitch is something that people did from the same tree over generations. I've seen some pitch trees that families have used for over 100 years. And they harvest the pitch by making a cut in the side of the tree, and the tree will give off pitch, which is a mixture of compounds. They call them oleoresins that are sticky, that have antibiotic properties that you can use for glue and waterproofing, but also for medicine. Geraldine, do you want to talk about pitch at all?
This one, the pine pitch tree, is something that we still use today in making our medicine. But in talking with our elder men on the pitch, they would go and use this to mend a canoe that had a crack in it, or use it as something that bonding to fix something that's been had a hole in it or something. But we today, I go look for the pine pitch where it is to make the medicine for those who in our community are needing this certain type of medicine. And pine pitch could, you need it to mix it with something else, as there's ingredients that we go and collect to make one medicine. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. Yes, I remember many people talking about pitch. You can chew it like chewing gum, as well as they say it's good for your teeth. It keeps them healthy. You can mix it with deer fat and make a salve from it. But nowadays, talking about adapting, people will make it with using Vaseline or even beeswax and olive oil. You can still make a medicinal salve from different kinds of tree pitch. And it's good for infections and sores of various kinds, or for getting out slivers and things like that. So this knowledge is built over, as I say, generations of observation and experience and sharing. And that's evident in the knowledge that I've learned about working with people from different communities. I hear the same kinds of information over and over again, because it's so widely known and shared across many, not just within communities, but across communities and across generations. If a woman marries a man in a different community, she brings her language and her knowledge with her. She teaches her children that knowledge. And so they get different knowledge from different members of their family. and they carry that forward, and in turn they share it. So all of the knowledge, for example, about how to pick camas bulbs, how to harvest camas bulbs in a sustainable way, how to harvest them at the right time of year, how not to mix them up with the death camas bulbs, which are very poisonous, how to tell them apart, how to leave the little bulbs behind so that they're going to grow into the edible size in a few years' time, and how to use fire to burn over and create prairies that is really excellent habitat for camas, but also for the berry bushes, the trailing blackberries and the huckleberries and so forth.
And the same for the camas bulbs. Back in the day when the old people used them, their grandparents used these, they actually took care of it like it was a garden. Like Nancy mentioned, you don't take the small bulb, but you take the larger ones, and how you cultivate that ground to keep it going and being safe. So every year they go back, they know which ones to pick and which ones are just starting to bud to leave behind. And in our community, there's no one out really going out and getting the camas bulbs anymore. So I went to the field that the old people talked about, and the camas bulbs are all small, not like they used to be. Thank you.
Thank you, Geraldine. I've heard that so many times from different elders. The root vegetables that people use, whether they're the spring beauty, mountain potato, or the yellow glacier lily, the camas bulbs, the rice root, the silverweed, all of them, the way people cultivated them in the past actually promotes their growth. And at one point, I calculated just from the elders' descriptions of how many bulbs they used to harvest. On Vancouver Island alone, we figure they were harvesting about 10 million bulbs a year, camas bulbs, and yet the very best places to get those bulbs, even today, are the places where people harvested them in the past, which just shows they had a way of sustaining the populations of camas in really interesting ways. I love this picture of my friend Cam and Eva Ann's kids when they were little. Again, they're grown up now from the Gitcat Nation, but they grew up out on the land, out on the water, learning about harvesting the seaweed, for example, or going up to the lake and harvesting the high bush cranberries and huckleberries and so forth. And that's the way, really the best way to teach kids, is to be with them out on the land. I think I can hear kids calling and laughing in the background.
There's my grandkids.
I love that. That's perfect. And as I said, this knowledge that people hold, it isn't static. It doesn't just stay in the past, but people know to use modern methods like using these boats now to allow them to get out more quickly when people have jobs to go to, and there's all the modern lifestyles that people have. They're still able to adapt that. And even the idea of using technology like we're doing here, or using the interactive web for the place names that Geraldine's going to practice. These are parts of, we could say, parts of adaptable traditional knowledge. And looking after the lands and waters. We've already talked about this a little in the managing of the camas to keep it productive over time. But people did that in so many different ways. This is Quaxistala Wafa here in the clam garden that his grandfather maintained out in the Broughton archipelago, where he grew up as a little boy with his grandparents. And he learned about making clam gardens back at that time, and he made a little clam garden himself. He also learned how to look after the tidal marsh root gardens to look after the edible roots that people relied on in those days. So these are all practices that are part of the traditional resource management systems. I mentioned Mary Thomas harvesting cherry bark, and there's a birch tree that has had bark harvested from it, which Mary again taught us about how you carefully cut the birch tree, because the life of the birch tree matters. When she's making her baskets, she's very, very careful to harvest the cedar roots and the birch bark so as not to harm the trees that she's taking them from. And these are all different practices: pruning the berry bushes, tilling and weeding and transplanting, clearing and burning areas on a relatively small scale though, tending over time, going from one place to another, families spreading out over the land so they don't impact any one area too much. Anything you want to add there, Geraldine?
I believe what you just talked about, how the old people, I call my elders the old people because they're gone now, and the ones that mentored us over time, of how to be the, what you call, like a keeper of the land, of where you need to, how you harvest carefully, and clearing and burning. That was a technique used in some of our areas for our plants, and the weeding and replanting. Some of the plants cannot be transplanted, but there are plants that can be transplanted from one location to another. And it's vital that we do this, especially in the forest industry now, because when they cut the trees down and used all the other big equipment, some of our plants are lost forever. So now with the partnership that we have, the understanding with the forestry, if they're going to log or cut, that they contact us to make sure there's nothing in there that we'll lose.
Mm-hmm. Thank goodness people are listening, paying more attention than in the past. We're just ready, almost ready to wind our talk up, because we're getting close to the time, and we want to leave some time for people to ask questions and to discuss things a little bit. We've already talked about the importance of the spiritual aspects and how the spirits of the plants and the places have to be respected and acknowledged. And you can see that in the ceremonies and the artwork and the stories, and in the way people prepare for harvesting medicine and so forth.
And another one around the spiritual aspects that are also important is our sacred sites, such as the petroglyph images that are throughout our territory, that we monitor it all the time and actually start speaking to public why it's important to preserve these images and tell the story that lays behind them. Some of them are connected to a compass. Some of them share the story that took place there back in time. But there are spiritual ones that are within certain areas that we protect. And through this protection, we're having to come out in a way that we're not just talking, but we're actually sharing this big image that has been placed from an ancestor many years ago. Petroglyph sites cannot be recorded in time unless it's underneath the ground and there's some charcoal or something nearby that will give you the year of it. But many of the images are on top of the ground. And I love Gabriola Island because here we found the sun star. The sun star is the one that tells the seasons. Like everybody knows the solace, the different times of the solace. Well, this solace is within our sun star. So when I started sharing that story of what this used for the old people back in their day, and why it's important to understanding some of the images that are not only in our community, but all over, from north to the south to the American side, west and east. Yeah.
Thank you, Geraldine. I've seen many beautiful petroglyphs art up and down the coast in the interior too.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see from what our description is that Indigenous knowledge is in many ways very compatible with Western science. It's a different way of looking at the world, a different knowledge system, but it really covers not only just straight Western science, but it covers philosophy, you could say, political science, education, history, law, and governance. It's more like a whole university full of knowledge that is embodied in an Indigenous knowledge system.
When we talked about the plants and connected to science, the plantain plant that 1 year we talked about the importance of what it was used for. And in our, I only know it as the frog leaf, but the scientific name is the plantain. And this one leaf can offer so much relief, whether it's an open sore or something else that's internal. And so up at BIU, they actually did a lab study on this plantain, and, you know, to see what the impurities were within it. And, you know, what we talked about, the evidence came through that lab test on it. So education in plants is so important. And the language that we have to our plants, there's language that we use in our Hulkamanum speaking dialect, and the philosophy around it, and law and governance all goes hand in hand. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's a very important plant. So we know, as Bob said yesterday, science alone cannot solve the problems that we're facing today. They're too big, and scientists know what we need to do, but we also need people who can enact some of the recommendations. We need politicians, we need social and economic systems that are more sustainable, that help us to be more sustainable. And so this is where Indigenous knowledge systems can come in. Bob talked about the erosion of some of the deterioration that's happened around the planet. And just one example that I put up, and we're soon going to be winding up here, but is the springbank clover. It's a native species of clover. And those of you who know the Victoria area might know Clover Point at Beacon Hill Park is named after this clover, but you don't find that clover around Clover Point anymore, or around that part of the country. And that's just one example of a plant that is much more restricted in its range because of our industrial and urbanization and so forth. So we need to keep this knowledge alive, and you can see all the different ways that it's so important for us. These are some of the examples, and Geraldine's already talked about how important the language is. And here we see Dr. Adosti Judy Thompson, who is now doing language revitalization work at the University of Victoria in her Tahltan language and with other Indigenous languages. There she is up at Hartley Bay with the children there. I think we're just about out of time, and I'm not going to say too much more. We know some of the problems. We've introduced plants and animals around the world and have homogenized a lot of our environments, so that we have trees growing from North America in Australia, New Zealand, Scotland, and we have a lot of European plants that have taken over our native plants here in Western North America. You can't tell the difference between many of these agricultural areas, even though they're in different parts of the world. So I think we have to work to understand that biocultural diversity is really, really important to maintain. It makes us more resilient. So this is the last message, I think, that this is given, this pandemic that we're facing right now has given us a chance to think about what we're doing, but the impacts we have on the planet, and that we have to start looking more closely at what nature needs and the processes, and working with natural processes, not against them. And stopping giving priority to economic systems and recognizing that our environmental systems are key to supporting our economic and social systems, not the other way around. The environment we all need more than anything else to keep us and sustain us in our lives and the lives of all the other species that we share the planet with. Geraldine, do you have anything to add to that?
Just that, you know, the importance of this, the impacts today, and how we step up to acknowledge the areas that are at risk, and especially the ones in the forest area. But I believe the old people say, if you can understand the word, the comment, from the mountains to the rivers to the ocean, back to the land, including the environment and all its resources that comes with each, is so vital that we as land stewardship need to, with our knowledge that we have, to continue talking about the importance of why we have to step up and start acknowledging and sharing the wisdom that has been passed on to us, to get involved, to understand the environmental issues or economics of our areas. And today, that's what we're doing. The very thing of understanding the environment, especially with this COVID-19 pandemic, you know, understanding that what it can cause, what could happen. It's terrible. It is parallel to the processes that we have with our environmental spaces, whether that be in the water or on land or within the air. Yeah, we breathe. Thank you.
So that pretty well concludes our presentation. Those of you who don't know about Wildwood, we hope that you'll come and visit us there. And it's a wonderful forest with a learning center. And you can visit us virtually online. And just one final thought. Learning and caring about the cultural richness and biological diversity in our own home places is something that all of us can do wherever we are in the world to help. And it can bring endless fascination in our own lives and can make a difference into the future.
That was absolutely incredible. Thank you, Nancy. Thank you, Geraldine. I would just, I'm just awash in gratitude for this knowledge to come forward. There is just so much we need to know, and I'm grateful that we live in such a beautiful place thanks to the stewardship that has been ever present. I think, though, before we continue with the questions, we created a little poll together. So this is where you have the opportunity to be involved. So I'll read out these questions, but feel free. There's a scroll bar on the right. You can go up and down with this little poll. But we'd just love to hear from you. So how can you be more supportive of Indigenous ecological wisdom? Multiple choice. By growing or sourcing food locally, learning about local governance in your region, community interaction and sharing, lifelong learning, protection and preservation of nature, community leadership, by bringing Indigenous knowledge into schools. Now, there's no wrong answer. I'll have to let you know that. And for those of you who have done the first one, the second one is, are you interested in learning more about Indigenous knowledge? Okay, so here's where our answers are. And like I said, there's no wrong answer, right? Nancy, Geraldine, these are all good answers.
Those are great. Yeah, it would be hard to put one above the other. All of them are important, I think.
But I love seeing here that protection and preservation of nature is right up there, and followed by bring Indigenous knowledge into schools. Like, how beautiful is that? Yeah. And then, yes, there was like 98% of the folks here on this call, which no surprise, are interested in knowing more about Indigenous knowledge. So did you want to add anything, or shall we move to questions?
Move to questions.
Okay, over to the questions. We have quite a few here, and I'm just going to try to work through these. So I'll let you decide who answers, or maybe you both want to answer. This one's from Douglas. Do you think reconciliation and redress should hold corporations liable for the negative impacts to watersheds, forest health, salmon, wildlife, climate and community sustainability from short rotation corporate industrial fiber mining?
I believe through reconciliation, the truth and reconciliation, it's vital that we have our leadership right behind and helping us do what we do. Nancy, did you have anything you wanted to add?
No, I think it's a good question. We all in society have to take some responsibility for the way corporations have used the land and resources, because they've been allowed to do that by our governance systems. And so I think, yes, they need to be held accountable, but so do all of us who have participated in one way or another in what's happened. And so we all need to not just point fingers of blame, but we all need to take responsibility to change the way we are behaving and to make our lives as individuals and in society more sustainable.
This one is from Mabel. It's basically along the same lines. Maybe just you could elaborate a little more. This is to Nancy and Geraldine. Thank you so much for sharing your Indigenous wisdom and knowledge with us. Recently, the provincial government endorsed the UN Declaration of Indigenous Rights. Are you more hopeful now that there will be improved reconciliation between the provincial and local governments with Indigenous people to use their wisdom and knowledge?
I can speak for Sandford community, and I do believe that reconciliation is at the forefront with anything that we do and what we're connected to, whether that's through the organizations, something like BC Hydro or archaeological sites, the forest, the watersheds, the estuary. Every one of these topics are at the forefront with our leadership that are on council today. And it's probably not a day go by that they have connecting with whomever they need to about what we're concerned about.
Mm-hmm. And I'd like to just add that I'm very heartened and optimistic. I've seen a big change myself, and probably Geraldine has too. There's been a resurgence and revitalization of Indigenous languages and knowledge since over the last 50 years or so. There was so much suppression of that knowledge of Indigenous food, of language during the time of the residential schools and all of the other things that went with that. And I think now with both British Columbia and Canada being signatory to the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, with the results of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, I feel quite hopeful. And I think one of the keys to ensuring that this happens is through education, through the school system and the universities.
Excellent, thank you. This one's from Stephen. What are some creative solutions for incorporating Indigenous wisdom into resource management practices? For example, forestry and water management. Is it through education, or can practicing foresters be provided with key information that they can incorporate into their practices? Like, for example, have you participated in workshops with resource professionals in the private sector and government?
Yeah, I could add to that. Being the elder in residence up at Vancouver Island University, we are part of a team where we meet around with timber westland, forest lands, and the ecosystems. So we, being the elder at the table, bring out some of the concerns, whether that be logging practices and what needs to be changed, how, if they're next to a sacred burial site or a spiritual site, they need to be aware of it. Today, we're confronted with gates, locked gates that lead a path to a sacred spiritual site, or we have to go to the forestry to get a key to unlock it. And now we have that connection where we're not having to go and get it unlocked every time we go, because sometimes it's before daybreak. So yeah, I and along with our leadership, they too have a body of individuals who are at the forefront around management, whether that's within the estuary or with the forestry practices.
Mm-hmm.
Anything you'd like to add, Nancy?
Just something that came to mind as I was listening to Geraldine and to the question as well. Just one example of what could be changed. I think of the alder tree, which in industrial forestry has been like considered a terrible weed to get rid of as quickly as possible and to poison with Roundup or to cut down or whatever. And to me, the alder is representative of wonderful values that First Nations have had. It's a very, very important medicine tree. It's good fuel for smoking fish. Its bark is used for dye and medicine, and you can eat the inner bark. And it is a nitrogen fixing tree, so it actually helps to prepare the soil for the newer generation of coniferous trees that will eventually come in and overtake it in a natural cycle. So trying to work with natural cycles rather than to always be trying to overcome them or to fight them, I think is one of the lessons that Indigenous knowledge can teach us, that all of these species have value, and we need to recognize that in our forest practices.
Excellent. Kathy has asked, we have much to learn about this gentle way to live on the land. Thanks to Dr. Turner and Elder Geraldine Manson for making sure these practices survive. How can non-Indigenous people learn more about these practices and wisdom?
One of the things that we do at the university, we have protocol sessions. And within these protocol sessions offered not only to those within the campus area, but outside, like citizens who are interested in the topic that we're speaking on. And sometimes those topics are around truth and reconciliation. They're around the medicinal medicines, things like that. So I know if Vancouver Island University has that offered, because I actually sit and participate in these sessions.
Nancy?
Thanks, Geraldine. Yes, and I think other universities, I think will have First People's Houses. They have different programs that are offered where people would have the chance to go and listen and learn from elders or Indigenous students and Indigenous programs. There are courses that you can take at universities to become more familiar with Indigenous knowledge systems. And many times First Nations communities are very welcoming to outsiders who want to come and learn, but you just need to be very respectful and follow the protocols that are offered to you. Sometimes there are seafood festivals or things like that that you can go and participate in. And at Wildwood Ecoforest, we have sometimes had Indigenous teachers come and participate in our programs and with the general public. And that would be a good opportunity for people to learn more.
I thank you for that, Nancy, and thank you, Geraldine. I would love to just add that I think Wildwood is a very, very special place, and they're one of our partners in this series this week. And we were to have events there live in person until COVID got in the way, and you were to be there live. But so we're really grateful you can be on this call. But if you haven't had a chance to visit Wildwood, it is a very special place, only an hour and a half from Victoria, or not even an hour and a half. It's in the Cedar area. And there, you know, it's such a magnificent story that's behind that. That's something, Nancy, you could just tell a little bit more, or Geraldine, a little bit more about Wildwood.
Wildwood was founded by a man named Merv Wilkinson, who purchased property there at Yellow Point, a piece of forested land that he first intended to clear and convert into a farm. And then he got interested in forestry, and he went to UBC and he met a European forester there who talked about some of the sustainable selective type of logging that could be done rather than the clear cutting method that is often used industrially here on the BC coast. And so he started implementing this idea of sustainably logging his land, selectively logging, leaving the very best trees to seed the new forest to come, and taking trees no faster than they can be replaced by their own natural growth. And so doing that, he maintained a forest while still using the forest and the trees in the forest. But he always was very interested in keeping the habitat for wildlife, and he used the birds as insect control. So he never used pesticides or insecticides. He never planted trees, they planted themselves. And he maintained this amazing forest that has diverse species, he maintained the big old growth Douglas firs. And when he passed away some years ago, the forest steward the Ecoforest was taken over and stewarded by first the TLC, the Land Conservancy, and then by the Ecoforestry Institute Society. And it's now, it will go on in perpetuity as a forest that people use and appreciate, but maintain and sustain as a fully functioning ecosystem.
Yes, it's a beautiful place if you ever get an opportunity to walk the property, and there is a lovely lake there, and there's a homestead where Merv lived that has been completely redone as a vacation rental. So if you ever get a chance, when we come through all this, if you get a chance to go visit, please do, and there are tours there. Now, there's another question here. There's quite a few. I'm just going to work through them. What role does Geraldine Manson see for directing the restoration of forests on Vancouver Island for Indigenous communities?
Well, I can only speak for Sanemo community and the forests, surrounding forests. And who owns, what company owns it. And like I mentioned earlier, the Timber West is adamant of being at the forefront, at the table with us whenever we have a concern, whether that's through the plants or that's through the water, the fresh river water, or the trees, and what trees to protect. And actually they are donors to some of the trees that make our poles or our canoe.
Working together with the forestry companies is becoming more common, and it leads to some really interesting collaborative partnerships that are happening with the Tsoke Nation and Snuneymuxw and many other nations on the coast.
Wonderful. This question is from Valerie. I'm honored to have attended this event. Deep thanks to Elder Geraldine and Nancy. How can we as settler allies support Indigenous knowledge systems in a highly respectful way?
Maybe I could jump in there, Geraldine, and just remind Valerie what I was taught by elders, that they were taught: use these and these before you use this. So just be respectful and listen. I say, I was told, don't ask too many questions. Just listen and be respectful. And it's amazing how much you will be shared with you if you show that you're interested, and in a very good way. People really appreciate that. Geraldine, would you agree with that?
I agree with everything you said, because 17 years of being mentored by my old people, of learning the land base, learning the importance of, and to be able, and the most important tool that you have with us right at this very moment is our hearing. Our hearing becomes, and then our eyesight. And if we're just learning something, we don't speak. There were times that I wasn't able to speak at all, but just take direction from the old people. And it was repetitive, over and over, repetitive teaching that allowed us to be, all this knowledge to be absorbed within us. And I believe it's the same within any community, that where as a student, we don't have that voice because the old people are giving their time to teach us something, whether that's culture, whether that's spiritual or language. Sometimes I'd got up early morning and it had to be on their time, not my time.
Thank you, Geraldine. There's another question here from Bonnie. Are you hopeful that Indigenous wisdom will be sustained? Are there current groups of Indigenous people's knowledge in traditional practices to replace the current population of elders?
Yes, yes. I guess I'm only 68, and yet my knowledge has been given to me over 17 years ago. So now it's time to mentor someone, to start walking in my footsteps, my shadow, learning. I can't choose anybody. I was chosen by the group of elders back in the day, but today you can't do that with the young people. It has to be individuals who are eager to learn, to capture what I hold, and to get up early morning, because it's hands-on, a lot of hands-on training that we were given to be able to absorb what we know, from the mountains to the rivers to the ocean and back to the land. Mentoring. And I've actually applied for a project to mentor two individual, has to be male, female, to shadow me. And that'll be within a year, 2 years before intense training.
Lucky them. That's all I can say. Nancy, did you want to say anything?
I feel very optimistic. When I first started learning about this, about plants from First Nations, everybody said, oh, you better learn it all. It'll be gone in 10 years. That was back in the late 1960s. And now I look back on that and I think, yeah, it was those cultural refugia that I talked about. The people who managed to retain that knowledge through a time when the pressures against holding it were so strong, but they still retained it and they taught it and they passed it along to their young people. And today, there are many people like Geraldine and many, many others, Kim Rakamakudasi, Pauline Waterfall. I could name many, many others, Bonnie Thomas, Barbara Wilson, who have retained that knowledge and who are also busy sharing it, passing it on in a good way. So that I think more than ever, there's support for it and an interest in it. And I would say a real resurgence, which is happening very widely.
It's very exciting. Thank you both for those answers. All of these answers are so interesting. And Scott has asking or saying, actually, it's exciting to hear about the book of Sinemu place names. Might there be an equivalent book of place names for the southern tip of the island, Victoria, Oakbay, Esquimalt, Saanich?
I can't speak for those folks, but I think the project that Geraldine has been doing will be an inspiration. And I know that there are definitely place names books for the Saanich people. My friend Kevin Paul worked on one of those, John Elliott. And now there are interactive features that can be added to the original just hard copy books. And I have a feeling that that what Geraldine is doing will inspire many other First Nations to follow.
I would second that. This has been very inspirational. There's a question from an anonymous attendee. If camas bulbs thrive with harvesting in a good way, are there any Indigenous people using this food, and/or could camas bulbs become a staple for everyone?
I'm going to answer it going backwards. Can camas bulbs be harvested or maintained for everyone? Yes. Understanding this is a dietary that was for the old people in replace of, back then was potatoes, starchy foods. Camas bulb was one of them. And like I mentioned before, they harvested their fields, they maintained it, they looked after it. And once you understand how it's like having a green thumb, to be able to understand the plant and what type of soil it uses and how it thrives and etc. You can't just plant it anywhere. You have to study it where original site is, and do you have that type of site nearby to transplant that bulb?
The camas, it's an interesting carbohydrate source because the main carbohydrate in camas bulbs is inulin, which is a complex of fructose and fructans that has to be broken down to make it more digestible. Other inulin foods are Jerusalem artichoke, for example, dandelion root and chicory as well are inulin foods. And so they require specialized knowledge about cooking the bulbs to make them more digestible. But I think that given how important they've been in the past and how they were a staple of people's diet, not only in this area, but in as far south as California and east into Montana, that I think it's very feasible for them to be reinstated as a food that would be healthy and nutritious when people learn how to process it and prepare it properly. Not to confuse it with death camas.
What do they taste like? I'm curious. Are they sweet? Are they savory?
They're earthy. They're not sweet. Yeah. I'm trying to think of what to compare it with.
I sort of think of a roasted chestnut. Sort of, when they're cooked, they turn brownish color when they're pit cooked, and yeah, they're sort of nutty, earthy.
Right. And in addition to your books and your knowledge, can you share where people may learn more about Indigenous knowledge? What can they do? I mean, where's the best sources if they live here on the island or they're international? What do you recommend? Do you have a recommended reading list or video list or anything?
Yeah. Nancy, for me personally, to get connected with the communities that are nearby you, First Nations communities. Yeah. You can even take one name that was given to you, and you probably can Google that name, and the whole source of things will come up. I actually Googled my name, and I said, "Oh my gosh, I'm on the internet."
I haven't had the courage to do that, but yeah, I think just about everywhere there are people who would be happy to have you volunteer for certain things, different restoration projects, community gardens, almost there are many different ways that you can contribute, and by contributing you are learning and enriching your own life at the same time. Yeah. There are many partnerships that can be created and have been created.
And I've got all kinds of things in the question and answer box where people are saying, read Nancy's books, they're fantastic. Earth's Blanket, make sure you check that one out. So thank you to everyone for your questions. And thanks again to Geraldine Manson and Dr. Nancy Turner, and to our partners in this presentation, the Wildwood Ecoforest Institute Society and John O'Riordan of the Gail O'Riordan Climate and the Arts Legacy Series. And of course to you, our audience. And before we close, Geraldine is going to bring in her drumming once again with a traditional closing song.
Hi, cho, ha, ha. Hi, cho, ha, 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 ha. Was me, Nitana Nisali Sitzel Tamu Itana Tamu I This song is about connecting back to the land. The land that we walk, the earth that we walk on is sacred. And every time we walk over it, it embraces us and gives us the energy that we're looking for. Connecting to the waters, whether that be salt water, fresh water, they too have a voice. They too hear us when we speak to them. And so important to know the animals that are around you, as they are very key to the surroundings and being that spiritual guidance to the land and all its beautiful surroundings. Haichka. There.